Welcome to Ian Cinema, your destination for endless entertainment and unforgettable movie moments. Discover exciting films, inspiring stories, and cinematic journeys across every genre. Whether you love action, drama, thrillers, or timeless favorites, there's always something waiting for you here. Sit back, enjoy the experience, and let Ian Cinema bring the magic of movies to your screen. The story begins in 1969, the year the United States Navy established its elite fighter weapons school. Although its official name sounded formal and prestigious among naval aviators, the program soon became famous by a much simpler name, Top Gun. The base is buzzing with energy as ambitious young pilots arrive, each determined to prove they have what it takes to stand among the very best. Riding into this high-pressure environment on his motorcycle is Captain Pete Maverick Mitchell. His reputation precedes him. Known for his fearless attitude, willingness to take risks, and refusal to follow the rules, Maverick is preparing for another high-stakes mission in testing an advanced experimental aircraft designed to push the limits of speed and maneuverability. However, Maverick's excitement is cut short when he learns that Rear Admiral Chester Hamm Kane is arriving at the facility. Concerned about the program's increasing safety risks and rising costs, the Admiral plans to shut the entire project down. Unwilling to let the program end without one final attempt, Maverick decides to make a bold statement. He climbs into the cutting-edge scramjet and launches into the sky. Once airborne, he pushes the aircraft far beyond its expected limits. Engineers and crew watch in disbelief as the jet dramatically exceeds its projected performance, blasting past Mach 9 and eventually reaching the astonishing speed of Mach 10. For a brief moment, everyone is stunned by the achievement, but Maverick still isn't satisfied. Driven by his relentless obsession with speed, he continues accelerating. The aircraft begins to buckle under the immense pressure, and only moments later, disaster strikes. The scramjet tears apart in midair, erupting into a violent explosion before crashing across the desert and leaving wreckage scattered over the landscape. Miraculously, Maverick survives with only minor injuries. Rear Admiral Kane, however, is furious. With the experimental aircraft destroyed, he prepares to hold Maverick responsible for the catastrophic accident. But before Maverick can do so, unexpected orders arrive, requiring him to report immediately to Naval Air Station North Island. Upon arrival, he is greeted by two senior officers, Admiral Bo Cyclone Simpson and Admiral Solomon Warlock Bates. They explain that he has been called back for a mission unlike anything the Navy has attempted before. A hostile nation has built a heavily fortified uranium enrichment facility deep within mountainous terrain. The objective is to destroy the facility, and Maverick's responsibility is to train a new generation of pilots for the dangerous operation. Despite his years of experience, Maverick is unsure whether he is the right man for the job. He questions whether he can prepare these young aviators for a mission with such slim chances of survival. Cyclone shares his doubts and openly questions Maverick's ability to succeed. Warlock, however, sees things differently. He believes Maverick's instincts, fearless nature, and unconventional teaching methods are precisely what these young pilots need if they are going to survive the seemingly impossible mission. Later that evening, Maverick visits a local bar, where he receives an unexpected surprise. There, he comes face to face with Penny Benjamin, a woman from his past. Years earlier, Maverick had disappeared from her life without explanation, leaving unresolved tension between them. His actions had also created problems with her father, who had once been Maverick's commanding officer. To Maverick's surprise, Penny welcomes him warmly despite their complicated history. The reunion soon becomes awkward when Penny decides to buy drinks for everyone in the crowded bar, including a group of talented but extremely confident naval aviators. Among them is Jake Hangman Sirezan, whose swagger and self-confidence immediately make him stand out. The group also includes Natasha Phoenix Trace, the dependable Robert Bob Floyd, Ruben Payback Fitch, and the energetic Mickey Fanboy Garcia. As the night continues, the The pilots boast about their skills and compete for attention. Then Bradley "Rooster" Bradshaw walks into the bar. The moment Maverick sees him, he becomes visibly unsettled. Rooster is the son of Nick "Goose" Bradshaw, Maverick's closest friend and former radar intercept officer, who died years earlier in a tragic training accident. Seeing Goose's son brings back painful memories that Maverick has spent years trying to bury. Things become even more embarrassing when Maverick discovers that his credit card has been declined. Hangman and Payback take full advantage of the situation, jokingly tossing him out of the bar while everyone else laughs. Outside, Maverick stops when he hears music coming from inside. Rooster is sitting at the piano, playing with the same passion and enthusiasm that once reminded Maverick of Goose. The moment brings back the guilt Maverick has carried with him for years. Later, wanting to settle what he owes, Maverick returns and gives Penny an envelope filled with cash. The following day, Penny invites him onto her sailboat, away from the noise and pressure of the naval base. The two spend time catching up, reminiscing about the past, and cautiously attempting to repair the relationship they left unfinished years earlier. Meanwhile, preparations for the mission begin. Maverick gathers the pilots and gives them a serious briefing about the dangers ahead. He warns them that flying too high could lead to oxygen deprivation and loss of consciousness. Maintaining the correct altitude, he explains, will be critical if they hope to complete the attack successfully. Once training begins, the differences between the pilots quickly become obvious. Rooster flies carefully and methodically, rarely taking unnecessary risks. Hangman, by contrast, thrives on provocation and enjoys pushing people's buttons. During one heated exchange, Hangman brings up Maverick's history with Goose, immediately intensifying the tension between himself and Rooster. The argument quickly escalates, forcing the other pilots to step in before it turns into a physical fight. Not long afterward, Maverick receives a message from an old friend. Iceman Kazansky wants to see him. Years have passed since their rivalry evolved into a genuine friendship. Unfortunately, Iceman is now battling throat cancer and can communicate only through a computer. During their meeting, Maverick opens up about his fears concerning Rooster. He worries that if he pushes Goose's son too hard, the tragedy of the past could happen all over again. Iceman listens carefully before reminding Maverick of an important truth: the young pilots need him, and Rooster needs him most of all. Running away from responsibility will not protect anyone. Although weakened by illness, Iceman's words have a powerful effect on Maverick. Their conversation restores his sense of purpose and gives him the confidence to continue. The next morning, Cyclone walks onto the runway expecting to see the pilots training. Instead, the area is completely empty. Confused, he searches the base until he finally discovers Maverick and the recruits on the beach, shirtless and enjoying the sunshine. The pilots are engaged in an intense game of beach volleyball, building teamwork and camaraderie in a way that only Maverick could defend. Cyclone watches with obvious disapproval, clearly unconvinced by what he sees. To him, it looks more like a day off than serious military preparation. Maverick, however, insists that the game serves a greater purpose. Building trust and chemistry among the pilots, he explains, can be just as important as technical flight training. Judging by the laughter, friendly competition, and growing sense of unity among the team, his unconventional approach appears to be working. Later, Maverick spends more time with Penny. As they walk along the shoreline, away from the pressure surrounding the mission, Maverick opens up about a burden he has carried for years. He tells her about Rooster's mother and the promise he made before her death. She had asked him to look after her son. And ever since, Maverick has felt personally responsible for Rooster's future and safety. Back at the base, training becomes increasingly intense. The pilots are pushed harder than ever as they attempt to recreate the conditions they will face during the actual mission. Their objective is extremely difficult: execute a precision strike against a heavily defended target while navigating dangerous mountainous terrain. Despite their determination, none of the pilots manages to complete the exercise successfully. The challenge proves far more demanding than expected. During one attempt, Phoenix is forced to eject from her aircraft before it crashes, demonstrating just how dangerous the real mission will be. After the failed exercise, Maverick reviews the pilots' performances. He singles out Rooster, criticizing him for being too cautious and hesitant during crucial moments. The criticism immediately creates tension. Already carrying years of resentment, Rooster fires back. He accuses Maverick of interfering with his career and holding him back from opportunities that could have changed his future. Their emotions quickly boil over, and the confrontation threatens to spiral out of control. Before either man can say anything more, Morlock arrives with devastating news. Tom "Iceman" Kazansky has died. The announcement leaves everyone stunned. Soon afterward, a solemn funeral is held to honor Iceman's life and service. Maverick, Penny, and the entire group of pilots gather alongside their fellow Navy personnel to pay their final respects. The atmosphere is filled with grief. For Maverick, the loss is especially painful. He has lost not only a legendary pilot but also one of the few people who truly understood him. In the days that follow, morale remains low. As evening settles over the base, Cyclone takes direct control of the training program and presents a revised strategy for the mission. He believes a more conservative approach will give the pilots a better chance of succeeding. The pilots listen carefully, but uncertainty remains as they prepare for the dangerous mission ahead. Many people question whether Cyclone's plan can realistically achieve its objective within such a strict time limit. Then, without warning, a familiar roar cuts across the airfield. Everyone turns toward the runway as an F-18 launches into the sky at incredible speed. It's Maverick, determined to prove what is possible. Maverick takes one of the fighter jets into the air and flies the mission profile himself. Radar operators watch in disbelief as he navigates the challenging course with remarkable precision. Every maneuver is executed flawlessly. He races through the terrain, threads the aircraft through narrow passages, and reaches the target within the required time. At the very last moment, he delivers a successful strike with only seconds to spare. The demonstration leaves everyone speechless. The pilots who once questioned Maverick's methods now see firsthand why he remains one of the Navy's most respected aviators. His performance does more than validate the mission, it proves that the mission can actually be accomplished. With confidence restored, preparations for the real operation begin immediately. When the strike team is finalized, Maverick personally chooses Rooster as his wingman. Joining them are Hangman, Phoenix, Fanboy, Payback, and Bob. The remaining pilots stay on standby in case they are needed. The mission begins. Flying dangerously low through rugged terrain, the team races toward enemy territory while trying to avoid detection. Mountains and valleys rush past at incredible speed as missile systems constantly threaten to lock onto their aircraft. At one point, Rooster falls behind the formation. For a tense moment, it looks as though he may lose his position completely. Fortunately, he regains control and quickly returns to formation. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier supporting the operation launches a wave of Tomahawk missiles towards the enemy airfield. The attack damages the runway and disrupts enemy operations, forcing hostile fighters to respond amid the chaos. As the strike team reaches the target area, timing becomes critical. Working together with perfect coordination, they launch their attack. The uranium enrichment facility is hit directly. A massive explosion erupts, completely destroying the target. But the mission is far from over. Enemy aircraft are already moving in to intercept them. As the pilots begin their escape, hostile fighters rapidly close the distance. Missiles streak across the sky while warning alarms blare inside the cockpits. During the retreat, Rooster's aircraft comes under direct threat. Before disaster can strike, Maverick places himself between Rooster and the incoming attack, sacrificing his own safety to protect him. Moments later, Maverick's jet is hit. The aircraft spirals out of control and crashes deep inside enemy territory. Believing Maverick may be dead, the rest of the team is left devastated. But Maverick survives the crash. His situation, however, is still desperate. An enemy helicopter quickly locates him and moves in for the kill. Just as the helicopter prepares to fire, A missile slams into it, engulfing the aircraft in flames. Maverick looks up and sees something he never expected. Rooster has come back for him, ignoring orders and risking his own life. Rooster has returned to rescue the man he once blamed for so much of his pain, but the danger is far from over. Enemy defenses lock onto Rooster's aircraft, and within seconds, a missile strikes. With no chance of saving the jet, Rooster ejects and barely escapes before the aircraft is destroyed. Now stranded together behind enemy lines, Maverick and Rooster must find another way home. Gunfire echoes in the distance as they race across hostile territory. Searching for an escape route, Maverick spots an aging F-14 Tomcat sitting inside a nearby enemy base. The idea sounds completely insane. When Maverick explains his plan, Rooster can hardly believe what he is hearing. Still, they have no better option. The two rush toward the aircraft, climb inside, and somehow manage to get the engines running. Moments later, they are airborne. Enemy fighters immediately give chase. The sky erupts into a chaotic dogfight filled with missiles, tracer rounds, and desperate evasive maneuvers. Drawing on every ounce of his experience, Maverick manages to shoot down two pursuing aircraft using a combination of gunfire and defensive countermeasures. Eventually, however, they run out of ammunition. Their situation becomes critical. A third enemy fighter lines up directly behind them, preparing to deliver the final blow. With nowhere left to run, Maverick and Rooster brace themselves for the worst. Then, out of nowhere, another jet tears across the sky. A missile launches. The pursuing enemy aircraft explodes instantly. The rescuer is Hangman. Arriving at the last possible moment, he saves Maverick and Rooster from certain destruction. Relieved and exhausted, the trio finally begins the journey home. When Maverick and Rooster land safely aboard the carrier, the entire crew erupts in celebration. Cheers echo across the flight deck as pilots and sailors rush forward to offer handshakes, hugs, and congratulations. Even Hangman, normally too proud to show much emotion, gives Rooster a respectful nod of approval. It is a small gesture, but one that means a great deal. As the excitement settles, Maverick notices something different about Rooster. The uncertainty that once defined him is gone. In its place are confidence, courage, and a quiet strength. For a brief moment, Rooster reminds Maverick of Goosey, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The two men exchange a meaningful look. No words are necessary. The ordeal they survived together has finally repaired the bond between them. Sometime later, inside a hangar, Maverick works on restoring a vintage P-51 Mustang. Rooster joins him, helping with the project as the two continue rebuilding their friendship. Eventually, Penny arrives, and Maverick invites her to join him for a flight. Together, they climb into the aircraft and take off into the open sky. Back in the hangar, Rooster pauses before placing a recent photograph of himself and Maverick beside an older picture of Maverick and Goose from many years earlier. The two photographs sit side by side, a quiet symbol of healing, friendship, and a legacy that has finally come full circle. When Top Gun: Maverick was first announced, I think a lot of people had the same reaction. Really? A sequel to Top Gun after more than 3 decades? On paper, this is exactly the kind of movie that usually sounds like a bad idea. Not just risky, a genuinely bad idea. It is the kind of late sequel that arrives years later, leans heavily on nostalgia, brings back the familiar music, recreates a few iconic shots, introduces a younger cast, and then expects the audience to cheer simply because they recognize the jacket. And honestly, there was every reason to be skeptical. The original Top Gun is more than just a movie to many people. It is a memory. It belongs to a very specific era of Hollywood confidence, filled with fast jets, sunsets, leather jackets, loud music, impossible hair, and that unmistakable 1980s blockbuster attitude where subtlety was hardly the priority. Some people love it for exactly those reasons. Others find it completely ridiculous for the same reasons. So bringing it back decades later could have gone wrong in countless ways. It could have felt desperate. It could have felt like a museum piece. It could have felt like Tom Cruise walking through a greatest hits album with fighter jets flying in the background. And honestly, before watching it, I would not have blamed anyone for asking, do we really need this? Hollywood has trained audiences to be suspicious of these kinds of sequels. Every few months, another old title is pulled out of storage, polished up, and sold back to us with the promise that this time the nostalgia will actually mean something. Sometimes it does, a lot of the time, it really doesn't. But Top Gun: Maverick is interesting because it arrives carrying all of the baggage from the beginning. It knows people remember the first film, it knows audiences want the music, the speed, the aircraft, and those familiar emotional moments, but it also has to prove that it is not simply there to remind you of something you once loved. That is the difficult part. A sequel like this cannot spend 2 hours simply saying, "Remember Top Gun?" That might earn a smile for a few minutes or even a big cheer in the theater, but nostalgia alone cannot carry an entire movie. At some point, the film has to stand on its own legs or, in this case, its own wings, and that is where the surprise comes in. Against all odds, this is not the lifeless nostalgia sequel it easily could have been. It is absolutely built on the memory of the original, and there is no pretending otherwise. The film clearly wants you to feel that connection, but it also understands that time has passed. Maverick is older, the world around him has changed, and the audience has changed too. That is what gives the movie its first major hook. This is not simply Top Gun again. It is a story about returning to something after too much time has passed and realizing that the old magic is still there but it cannot exist in exactly the same way anymore. And for me, that is what makes the film more compelling than a simple legacy sequel. It does not begin from a place of confidence. It begins with doubt. Can this still work? Can this character still matter? And perhaps most importantly, can the magic of Top Gun survive after all these years? Can a big, heartfelt, old-school action movie still connect with audiences the way it once did? That question quietly runs beneath the opening moments of Top Gun: Maverick, whether the film says it outright or not, and it is a smart place to begin. Because viewers are asking the same thing. A sequel arriving 36 years after the original should feel out of place. It should feel late, as though it missed its moment. But Top Gun: Maverick turns the challenge into the very reason the story exists. When we meet Maverick again, the film quickly makes one thing clear: he has not really moved on. He is older, of course. Time has left its mark, but in almost every meaningful way. Pete Mitchell is still Pete Mitchell, is still flying, still pushing limits, still frustrating those above him, and still treating rules more like suggestions from people who do not understand the sky the way he does. At first, there is something amusing about this. Technically, Maverick should no longer be where he is after all these years in the Navy. He should be sitting behind a desk with a higher rank, giving orders instead of breaking them. By now, he could have been an admiral, or at least someone important enough to stop being viewed as a problem that needs managing. But that never happened. He is still a captain, and the film makes it clear that this is not a random detail. It says almost everything about who Maverick has become. He could have climbed higher, but doing so would have meant leaving behind the one thing he truly understands of flying. That is both his tragedy and his charm. Maverick is not made for offices, politics, or quietly accepting that his best years are behind him. Put him in a room full of admirals, and he immediately seems uncomfortable. Put him in the cockpit of a fighter jet, and the film suddenly comes alive. That is where he belongs. What makes this interesting is that the movie does not present this as entirely heroic. It is not simply saying, "Look how cool he is, he never changed." There is a sadness beneath it, as well. Remaining unchanged may seem exciting from the outside, especially when it involves fighter jets and Tom Cruise doing what Tom Cruise does best. But emotionally, it can also mean standing still. Maverick has spent his life staying in motion, flying faster, pushing harder, avoiding promotions, responsibilities, and the parts of life that might force him to stop and confront what he has carried for so many years. So when the film opens with him testing experimental aircraft and chasing impossible speeds, It feels thrilling, but also surprisingly lonely. He is not surrounded by old friends. He is not settled. He is not at peace. He is simply still moving forward, and that is exactly where the film needs to find him. If this sequel had brought Maverick back as a perfectly adjusted senior officer, it would not have carried the same emotional weight. The point is that he remains brilliant, reckless, and valuable, yet increasingly out of step with the world around him. The Navy has changed. Technology has changed. The younger generation of pilots has changed. Even the role of the fighter pilot is evolving. But Maverick still holds onto the instinct that made him famous in the first place. When others say something cannot be done, he wants to prove that it can. The difference now is that the film is no longer asking whether this makes him cool. It is asking what it has cost him. Naturally, that leads him back to Top Gun. What works so well is that the film avoids a simple, sentimental return. Maverick is not welcomed back with applause or celebrated as a legend returning home. It is far messier than that. In fact, depending on who you ask, he is barely wanted at all. He is brought back because there is a problem. An almost impossible mission is approaching, and the Navy needs pilots who are skilled enough, disciplined enough, and daring enough to survive it. That combination is rare, and whether the people in charge like it or not, Maverick understands this kind of flying better than anyone. That is the contradiction at the heart of his character. The system constantly tries to push him aside, yet whenever the challenge becomes too extreme, that same system remembers exactly why it kept him around. This time, Maverick returns to Top Gun not as the young pilot trying to prove himself, but as the instructor, the mentor, the experienced figure standing before a new generation and showing them how far they must go. It is a clever reversal. The first film was about Maverick earning his place among the best. This film is about teaching the best while still not being entirely sure he is meant to teach at all. He knows how to fly. He knows how to survive. He knows how to do things that seem impossible on paper, but passing those skills on to others is different. There is a significant difference between being gifted and being responsible for other people's lives. That is where the sequel finds its real tension. Maverick can no longer be just the wild card. He cannot simply jump into a cockpit, break the rules, and escape the consequences with a smile. Now, every decision he makes influences the younger pilots watching him, and the film understands how uncomfortable that is for him. Maverick is not a natural teacher. He is not someone who calmly explains lessons with a marker in hand. Flying is his language. His teaching style is simple: get in the air and keep up. That gives his return to Top Gun a purpose beyond nostalgia. Yes, the familiar elements are all three: the uniforms, the hangars, the rivalries, and the classic military atmosphere. But the emotional perspective has changed. Maverick is no longer trying to become the future. He is trying to prepare it, even though part of him still refuses to accept that his own role has changed. That is why the setup works far better than it has any right to. The film does not bring Maverick back simply because audiences remember the name. It brings him back because Top Gun forces him to confront everything he has spent years avoiding: authority, age, responsibility, legacy, and the difficult truth that being the best pilot in the room is no longer enough. This is where Top Gun: Maverick separates itself from the original. The first film had a looser structure. It was part training movie, part rivalry story, part romance, and part music video filled with fighter jets and youthful confidence. Much of its appeal came from simply spending time in that world: the attitude, the competition, and the fantasy of being young, talented, fearless, and faster than everyone else. Maverick is far more focused. This time, everything revolves around a single mission. The film is not just about becoming better pilots or competing in training exercises. From early on, we know exactly what these pilots are preparing for. We know the target, the dangers, and how little room there is for error. That changes the rhythm of the entire story. Every training sequence has a purpose. Every mistake matters. Every moment in the air carries real weight. Every argument about timing, altitude, speed, and survival is connected to only a final test that the movie keeps moving toward. You can feel the film narrowing its focus as it goes along, almost like it is tightening a wire. And that helps a lot because with a movie like this, the plot does not need to be complicated. In fact, it probably works better because it is not complicated. The story is clean enough that the audience can understand the mission almost immediately, which means the attention does not come from confusion. It comes from watching people try to do something that looks impossible. Even when you understand that perfectly, that is a very old-school adventure movie a pleasure. You do not need a dozen twists. You do not need 20 factions or a villain giving speeches in the shadows. You just need a clear objective, a limited amount of time, and characters who we do not want to see fail. And for the most part, the movie gets that right. It takes Maverick, the character who has spent his life surviving by instinct, and places him inside a structure where instinct alone is not enough. He has to train other people to survive the kind of danger he would normally take on himself. That instantly changes the emotional pressure of the story because the mission is not just about whether Maverick can still fly. We already know what he can. The real question is whether he can prepare others to fly into something this dangerous and then live with the consequences of what he asks them to do. That is where the mission-driven structure becomes more than just a bloated device. It forces Maverick into a different kind of conflict. He cannot simply be the guy who breaks the rules anymore. He has to explain why the rules might need to be broken, and he has to do it in a way that gives these younger pilots a real chance. So, even when the film follows familiar beats, the structure keeps moving. There is a countdown feeling underneath everything. The characters may joke, compete, flirt, and clash, but the mission is always awaiting in the background, and the closer they get to it, the less it feels like a nostalgic reunion tour. It starts to feel like a test, and the mission itself is where the movie really starts to lock in because on paper, it is almost absurd. The pilots have to fly low, move fast, avoid enemy defenses, survive mountain terrain, hit an extremely small target, and somehow make it back out before the whole thing turns into a disaster. It is the kind of mission that sounds less like a military operation and more like someone designed a death trap and then asked, "Okay, who wants to volunteer?" But that is also why it works. The movie is very smart about making the audience understand the danger without drowning everything in a technical language. There is enough aviation talk to make the world feel serious, but not so much that you feel locked out of the scene. You do not need to understand every detail about altitude, timing, missiles or G-force to understand the basic problem. They have you to do something almost impossible, and if they get it wrong even slightly, people are not coming home. That clarity matters a lot because in a movie like this, the stakes cannot just be spoken. They have to be felt, and as Top Gun Maverick builds that feeling by making the mission look brutal long before anyone actually flies into enemy territory. The training runs are not just practice scenes, they are warnings. Every failed attempt shows us another way this mission can go wrong. Too slow and they were exposed, too high and they are detected, too late and they miss the window. Too much pressure and the budget itself starts to fail. The film keeps stacking those risks until the mission stops feeling like a standard action movie objective and starts feeling like a test of nerve, instinct, and physical endurance, and that gives the training scenes real tension. Usually in this kind of movie, the training is just there to prepare us for the good stuff later. Here, the training is the good stuff too because the characters are already fighting the mission before they ever reach it. They are fighting the clock, they are fighting their own limits, they are fighting the fear that a Maverick might be asking them to do something that simply cannot be done. That is also where Maverick's role becomes more complicated. He is not just telling them be brave. That would be easy. He is trying to teach them how to survive something that may not be survivable, and because he knows exactly how dangerous it is, every lesson carries this quiet pressure underneath it. He is pushing them hard because he has to, But he is also looking at Thessi pilots and understanding that some of them may not come back. That shadow hangs over the whole middle of the film. It is not dark in a grim, heavy way. This is still a big polished crowd-pleasing blockbuster. But the danger is present enough to give the movie weight. You are never confused about what the characters are training for. And you are never allowed to forget that skill alone might not be enough. That is what makes the setup so satisfying. The mission is simple. Yes, a very simple. But simple does not mean a weak. Sometimes a clean objective is exactly what an action movie needs. Give the audience the target. Show them why it is nearly impossible. Let them watch the characters fail, adjust, doubt themselves, and try again. By the time the final mission is approaching, the movie has done its job. You know the route, you know the danger, you know what has to happen. And because of that, every second in the air feels like it matters. Now, let's be honest about the story. This is not a complicated movie. Nobody is going to watch Top Gun Maverick and come away saying, "Wow, Ian never knew where that was going." The plot is pretty straightforward, but at times, it is predictable. At times, it is openly familiar. You can feel certain emotional beats coming before they arrive, and the movie is not exactly trying to hide them. But here is the thing, that does not automatically make the storytelling weak. In fact, part of why the film works for so many people is because it understands the kind of story it is telling. This is not trying to be some tangled political thriller or a deconstruction of military cinema. It is a clean old-school adventure story with a clear mission, clear emotional baggage, and clear character stakes. And sometimes that kind of clarity is underrated. The movie gives you exactly enough plot to keep everything moving. Maverick has unfinished business. Rooster has resentment. The under pilots have to prove themselves. The mission looks impossible. The clock is ticking. That is basically the engine of the film, and it is a strong enough engine to carry the whole thing. Could the writing be deeper in places? Absolutely. Some characters could have had more room. Some conflicts could have been less obvious. Some of the dialogue has that glossy blockbuster quality where people say exactly what the scene needs them to say. And yes, there are moments where the film steps right into a cheese without even pretending it is embarrassed. But there is a difference between a movie being simple and a movie being lazy. Maverick is simple, but it is not careless. It knows how to set up information, pay it off later, and keep the audience oriented. That matters more than people sometimes admit. You always understand where the story is, what the characters are trying to do, and why the next scene exists. That is probably why even some of the more conventional material lands better than expected. The film is not reinventing anything. It is arranging familiar pieces with the confidence. The reluctant mentor, the angry younger pilot, the old wound, the impossible mission, the romantic reconnection, the authority figure who doubts the hero. These are not new ingredients, but the movie cooks theme properly, and that is where a lot of legacy sequels fail. They bring back the old character, add a new generation, throw in references, and hope emotion appears automatically. Top Gun Maverick is more disciplined than that. It may be predictable, but it usually knows why it is being predictable. There is a comfort in that. You are not watching this film because the plot is going to outsmart you. You are watching because the movie knows how to build momentum, how to create pressure, and how to make familiar emotional beats feel satisfying instead of completely empty. That is no to nothing. A conventional story can still work beautifully if the execution has enough energy, sincerity, and craft behind it. And for most of its runtime, Maverick has those things. It is direct, it is polished, it is sometimes corny, but it moves with purpose. And in a blockbuster landscape where some movies confuse complexity with depth, there is something refreshing about a film that simply says, here is the mission, here we are the people, here is what they have yet to face, now watch them fly. Of course, there's no talking about Top Gun Maverick without talking about nostalgia. The movie knows exactly what people came to see. It knows the sound of those engines means something. Ida knows that certain music cues are going to hit people before a single line of dialogue does. It knows the image of aircraft moving across a glowing sky has been sitting in the memory of the first film's audience for decades. And honestly, the film is not shy about using that. From the opening stretch, a Maverick is clearly reaching back. The rhythm feels familiar, the music feels familiar. The whole atmosphere has this deliberate "we are back" quality to it. Not subtle exactly, but not accidental either. It is almost like the movie walks into the room wearing the old jacket and waits to see who recognizes it, and a lot of people did. That is part of the pleasure here. The film understands that Top Gun is not just remembered because of its plot. In fact, for many viewers, the plot might be the least important thing about it. People remember the feeling, the speed, the confidence, the music, the rivalry, the beach scene, the danger, the slightly ridiculous sincerity of it all. So, Emerald brings those things back. You get the familiar echoes. You get the legacy names. You get Goose hanging over the story like an old wound. You get Iceman returning with real emotional weight. You get the bar, the piano, the young pilots measuring each other up. The competitive energy, the romance, the sense that everyone in this world is either trying to prove something or outrun something, and yes, you get a danger zone because of course you do. A movie like this was never going to pretend the original did not exist, that it would have been dishonest. The whole reason this sequel has power is because time has passed and the film lets that time sit inside the story. It wants the audience to feel the distance between then and now. That is why the nostalgia works better than it might have. It is not only saying remember this, it is also asking what does this memory look like now. The old images come back but they do not land in exactly the same way. Maverick is not the young pilot trying to become a legend anymore. He is a legend, and that changes the meaning of almost every callback around him. The familiar world is still there, but he does not fit inside it quite so easily. That gives the nostalgia a slightly bittersweet edge. The movie can be exciting and sentimental at the same time. It can bring back the music and still remind you that the people connected to that music have aged, changed, disappeared, or been left behind. And that is where Top Gun Maverick separates itself from the laziest kind of revival, because the worst nostalgia sequels treat the pasta like a button. Press it and the audience reacts. This film does press those buttons, no question. But at its best, it also gives those buttons some emotional context. When the old material returns, it is not just decoration. It is part of Maverick's problem. He is surrounded by reminders of who he used to be, what he lost, and what he still has not dealt with. So, the nostalgia is not just fan service. Well, okay, sometimes it is fan service, but it is a fan service with a pulse, and that makes a difference. But nostalgia is tricky because the same thing that gives a Top Gun Maverick so much emotional power is also the thing that occasionally makes it feel a little too safe. There are moments where the callbacks work beautifully. You understand why they are there. You feel the history behind them. You can sense the movie using the pasta to create a heavier emotional atmosphere, especially when Maverick is forced to face the people and memories that he has spent years avoiding. That idea of the nostalgia is genuinely effective. But then there are other moments where the film gets very close to simply pointing at the original and saying you liked this before, right? And that is where it becomes more complicated, because yes, the music is exciting. The familiar lines are fun. The beach scene has that big knowingly cheesy energy. The bar scene has its own kind of charm. But after a while, you can feel the movie walking a very thin line between homage and repetition. Sometimes it lands on the right side of that line. Sometimes it does not, and I think your reaction to a Top Gun Maverick may depend on how much patience you have for that kind of legacy film. If you love the original, these echoes might feel like a part of the celebration. They might feel like the movie inviting you back into a world you already missed. But if you are less attached to Top Gunning, or if the first movie never meant that much to you, some of those same moments can feel a little obvious. Maybe even too calculated. That is a strange balance the film has to manage. It wants to be sincere, but it also wants applause. Ida wants to move forward, but it keeps looking over its shoulder. It wants to tell a new story, but it knows the oldest story is the reason most people shout up in the first place. And to be fair, that is not an easy position. A movie like this cannot completely ignore nostalgia. That would almost defeat the purpose. But if it relies on nostalgia too much, then it starts to feel less like a story and more like a carefully arranged memory tour. Maverick mostly avoids that trap, but not always. There are scenes where the emotional weight feels earned, especially when the past is tied to grief, guilt, or aging. Those moments give the callbacks meaning. They remind us that time has not just passed for the audience, it has passed for the characters, too. But there are also scenes where the callback is just there. You recognize it, you smile and then the movie moves on. That is not necessarily terrible. Sometimes a crowd-pleasing moment is allowed to simply please the crowd. Not every reference needs to carry deep thematic weight. But when a film uses that many familiar beats, it does risk becoming predictable in a different way. Not predictable because of the plot. Predictable because of the memory. You start to feel when the movie is about to reach back again. You can almost sense it winding up for another echo from 1986, and yet somehow even with that criticism, the nostalgia does not sink the film because underneath the familiar surfaces, there is still enough feeling, craft, and momentum to keep it alive. That is why I would not call the nostalgia lazy. It is too carefully handled for that, but I would say it is heavy. Very heavy in places. And whether that heaviness feels comforting or excessive probably depends on what Top Gun already means to you before the movie even begins. This is where the movie gets interesting because Top Gun Maverick is not just playing homage to the original. It is also repeating it, and the difference between those two things can be very thin. Homage feels like a conversation with the past. It takes something familiar and gives it a new reason to exist. Repetition is easier. Repetition just says, here I saw the thing again. Same shape, same rhythm, same emotional button. Maybe with better cameras and older actors, Maverick does both. There are moments where the film is clearly recreating the feeling of the first Top Gun, the competitive pilots, the music, the bar energy, the romantic pause between all the military tension, the athletic beach sequence, the old rivalry structure reappearing through a younger cast. You can feel the film arranging certain pieces in ways that are meant to trigger recognition. And sometimes, yes, it is a little obvious. You are watching and thinking, okay, I see what you were doing here. But the reason it does not collapse into pure imitation is because the emotional angle has shifted. The same kinds of scenes do not mean exactly what they meant before. In the original, that competitive energy was about younger pilots trying to prove they were the best. In Maverick, that same energy is still there, but now, Maverick is watching it from the other side. He is no longer the young guy in the room. He is the older figure looking at a generation that reminds him of who he used to be and maybe of what he lost along the way. That changes everything. The movie may borrow the shape of the first film, but the perspective is different. The nostalgia is not just a decoration. At its best, it becomes a way of showing distance. The world looks familiar, but Maverick's place inside it has changed. That is why some of the repeated beats work better than they should. A scene that could have been empty nervous becomes a little more bittersweet because Maverick is not just reliving the past, he's being forced to stand outside it and recognize that time has moved on without asking his permission. Still, the film does not always escape the danger of repetition. There are callbacks that feel meaningful and then there are callbacks that feel like the movie is checking items off a list. You can almost imagine somebody saying, we need the song. We need the beach moment. We need the bar scene. We need the old line. We need the emotional reference to Goose. And when you notice the machinery, the spell weakens a little. But I also think that is part of what makes Maverick such a fascinating legacy sequel. It is not completely free from the habits of modern nostalgia film. It absolutely wants the audience to recognize things. It wants that instant emotional connection. The difference is that it usually tries to build something on top of that recognition. Not always, but often enough. The film understands that simply a repeating Top Gun would not be enough after all this time. So, it uses a repetition almost like a mirror. It lets the Maverick see younger versions of older patterns, old mistakes, old rivalries, and old wounds. And through that, the movie starts to ask whether the past should be preserved, repaired, or finally left behind. That is what separates the stronger moments from the weaker ones. When the film repeats something just to make us remember, it can feel safe. When it repeats something to show how much has changed, it works. And Top Gun Maverick is at its best when it understands that difference. What really helps the sequel, though, is that Maverick himself is not treated like the exact same man from 1986. He is still a Maverick. The movie never forgets that. He still has that instinct to push past the limit just because someone told him the limit exists. He still has the same stubborn confidence, the same need to prove that a machine, a rule, or an admiral cannot fully define what a pilot is capable of. But he is not just the reckless young guy anymore. There is more silence around him now. More weight, more history sitting behind his eyes. And that makes him a lot more interesting. The first film gave us Maverick as pure movie star energy. He was charming, arrogant, dangerous, emotional, and sometimes honestly kind of irritating. That was part of the character. He was a young man convinced that talent could outrun consequence. In this film, consequence has caught up. Not in some loud melodramatic way. He is not walking around giving speeches about the pain every 5 minutes, but you can feel it in how he carries himself. He is still fast, still brilliant, still almost impossible to control. But now that recklessness has a different flavor, it does not feel like youthful arrogance anymore. It feels like a man who only knows how to keep living if he keeps moving. That is a subtle but important shift because the sequel could have easily turned him into a flawless legend. The returning hero, the old master, the guy who walks into the room and instantly proves all the other pilots are amateurs. And yes, the movie does give him plenty of those moments. But it also lets him look tired, not weak. Exactly. Just worn down by time. Guilt, and the strange loneliness of being someone who never really left the past behind. That is where Tom Cruise's performance matters. Cruise still brings the movie star spark, obviously. That is a part of the deal. But the more effective moments are the quieter ones where Maverick seems caught between the persona everyone expects him to be and the person he is afraid he has become. He is a legend, but he does not look fully comfortable being one. He can still fly better than almost anyone, but that does not solve the emotional problems waiting for him on the ground. He can survive via dangerous missions, but survival is not the same thing as peace. And for a character like Maverick, that a distinction matters. The film understands that age changes the meaning of rebellion. When you are young, breaking the rules can look exciting. When you are older and you are still breaking the same rules, the question becomes different. Is this courage? Is it stubbornness? Is it purpose? Or is it just the only identity you have left? That question hangs over this version of Maverick, and it gives the movie a little more texture than it might have had otherwise, because this is not just about whether Maverick can still do the job. The film answers that almost immediately. Of course, he can. The more interesting question is, what happens to a man who stayed excellent at one thing while the rest of his life remained unresolved? That is the Maverick we meet here. Still iconic, still dangerous. Still impossible to replace, but finally old enough for the movie to ask whether being impossible to replace has also made him impossible to move forward. And at a certain point, you also have to talk about the obvious thing. This movie is Tom Cruise. Not just starring Tom Cruise, Not just led by Tom Cruise. It is built around the entire idea of Tom Cruise as a movie star. That can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you feel about him, but in Top Gun Maverick, it is almost impossible to separate the film from the man at the center of it. The whole thing runs on that particular Cruise energy, the commitment, the intensity, the need to make everything feel bigger, faster, cleaner, sharper, more physical. You can feel him pushing in the movie. And honestly, that is a huge part of why it works, because Maverick is not just a character returning after decades, he is also an image returning. Tom Cruise in the cockpit, Tom Cruise refusing to slow down, Tom Cruise looking at a younger cast and somehow still feeling like the most dangerous persona in the room. The film knows this. It uses it completely. There is a slightly funny, almost self-aware quality to it. The younger pilots are supposed to be the new elite, the fresh generation, the future of aviation, but the movie keeps reminding us that Maverick is still the one they cannot touch. He is older than them, outranked by others, written off by the system, and yet the second he gets in the air, the whole hierarchy changes. Suddenly, everyone else is just trying to keep up. That is very much the Tom Cruise mythology, too. For years now, Cruise has built this reputation as the last major movie star who seems personally offended by the idea of cheating the audience. If there is a plane, he wants to be near the plane. If there is speed, he wants to feel the speed. If there is danger, he wants the camera close enough for us to believe it. And whether you find that inspiring or slightly insane, it gives the film a kind of sincerity that is hard to fake. Maverick does not feel like a star showing up to collect a paycheck from an old brand name. It feels like some idiot trying to prove that this kind of movie still matters, that practical spectacle still matters, that big screen action it can still make an audience lean forward instead of just watch passively. There is ego in that. Of course. A lot of ego. The movie absolutely wants us to believe that Maverick is still better than everybody. It wants us to believe that the old master has lessons no one else can teach. It wants to preserve the legend, not dismantle it. But the strange thing is Cruise sells it. He sells it because he commits to the physical side of the role, but also because he understands the emotional side of his own screen image. There is swagger here. But it is not empty swagger. It is attached to age, loss, guilt, and the pressure of being someone everyone expects to remain impossible forever. That makes the star persona more interesting than simple vanity. Because yes, this is Tom Cruise doing Tom Cruise things. Absolutely, no one should pretend otherwise. But the movie finds a way to turn that into part of the story. Maverick is also a man who has built his entire identity around being the one who goes further, flies faster, and refuses to stop. So, when we watch Cruise pushing himself on screen, it lines up almost perfectly with Maverick's own problem. The actor and the character started reflecting each other. Both are trying to prove they still belong in a world that keeps changing around them. Both are tied to an older style of action filmmaking. Both seem almost allergic to the idea of stepping aside quietly, and that is why the film has the charge that it does. It is not just about a pilot proving he can still fly. It is about a movie star proving that he's a kind of movie can still take off. What makes Cruise's return work better than just another victory lap is that the movie does not only lean on his confidence, it lets him look vulnerable. Not in a dramatic crying in the rain kind of way. That would not really feed a Maverick. His vulnerability is quieter than that. It comes through in pauses, and hesitation, in the way he reacts when the past suddenly stops being an idea and becomes a person standing in front of him. That is where this version of Maverick feels different. He can still walk into a room with a controlled Tom Cruise intensity. He can still stare down authority figures like he has already calculated 12 ways to disobey them. He can still get into a jet and make everyone else look like they are flying with training wheels. But on the ground, he is not untouchable. And the movie is smart enough to keep bringing him back down there. Because the cockpit is where Maverick feels powerful. That is the place where he can turn fear into an instinct. It is where he can solve via problems with speed, skill, and nerve. But grief does not work that way. Guilt does not work that way. Time does not work that way. You cannot outfly enthusiast things forever. That is the emotional pressure sitting underneath across the performance. There is still swagger, but there is also a kind of fatigue behind it. Not physical fatigue exactly. Because the film is very committed to showing that Maverick can still do the job. It is more like emotional exhaustion. A man who has spent decades as a being defined by movement is finally a being forced to stop long enough to feel what he has been carrying, and that is more interesting than just watching him be cool. The moments with Rooster bring this out sharply. Maverick is not simply dealing with a difficult student. He is looking at the son of the friend he lost, the son of the man whose death still follows him around like a shadow. Every conversation between them has something unsaid sitting underneath it. Maverick wants to protect him. Rooster does not want protection from him. And neither of them can talk about Guzia without reopening something that never healed properly. That tension gives Cruz a chance to play something more fertily than the usual impossible man action persona. He is still composed, but you can sense the cracks. He is still trying to lead, but he does not always know how to repair what he broke or what he thinks he broke. And then there is the Iceman. That scene works because it strips away so much of the old rivalry and leaves behind two men who have aged, suffered, and somehow remain connected. There is no need for the movie to over-explain it. The history is already there. You feel it before anyone says much. For Maverick, that moment is not about being the best pilot in the room. It is about facing someone who truly knows him. Someone who can see past the legend and recognize the man who is still stuck. That is where the vulnerability becomes the point, because Maverick's problem is not that he has lost his skill. He is not. The film makes that very clear. His problem is that skill has been his answer to everything, and now he is facing questions that flying cannot answer. Can he forgive himself? Can he let Rooster go? Can he accept that the past matters without letting it control the rest of his life? Those are not the loudest parts of the movie, but they are some of the most important. And Cruz, to his credit, does not overplay them. He lets the Maverick remain guarded. He lets the emotions sit underneath the surface. Which honestly feels right for the character. Maverick is not suddenly going to become a man who explains every feeling in perfect sentences. He is still Maverick, but now, when he smiles, there is history behind it. When he goes quiet, there is weight there, and when he flies, it no longer feels like just a thrill, it feels like escape. One of the more interesting things about Top Gun Maverick is that it does not treat a Maverick's refusal to change as purely heroic. At first, it almost looks that way. He is still the guy who will push all the aircraft further than anyone else. Still the guy who looks at a limit and immediately starts wondering whether that limit is real. Still the guy who annoys every superior officer in the room because frustratingly he is usually right about what he can do. That kind of fast stubbornness is fun to watch. It is part of why Maverick works as a character. He has always been the man who refuses to accept the safe answer, the easy answer, or the official answer. And in a movie like this, that is exciting. Nobody comes to Capon hoping the main character will calmly follow procedure and fill out paperwork, but the sequel adds something important. It asks, what happens when that same stubbornness keeps a man alive professionally but frozen emotionally? Because Maverick has not just refused promotion. He has refused movement, real movement, the kind that happens inside a person, the kind that forces you to admit that time has passed. People are gone, and the version of yourself you keep protecting may not be enough anymore. That is why his rank matters. On the surface, being stuck as a captain is almost a joke. Ida tells us Maverick never learned how to play the game, but underneath that, Ida tells us something sadder. Everyone else here from his generation seems to have moved into another phase of life. They grew up, took command, built families, changing shape with time. Maverick stayed in the cockpit, and yes, That makes him a legendary, but it also makes him lonely. The film keeps circling that idea without turning it into a speech. Maverick lives like someone who has mastered motion, but avoided progress. He can fly through danger, but he cannot quite fly out of the past. Goose Ice is still there, Iceman is still there, the choices Maverick made years ago is still there, waiting for him the moment a rooster walks into the story. But when the past stops being background, Rooster is not just another pilot, he is the living reminder of Maverick's biggest wound. He is Goose's son, but he is also proof that grief does not stay neatly buried. It grows up, it gets older, it learns how to stare back at you. And Maverick has no easy answer for that. He has spent years trying to protect Rooster in his own way. Protection can become control when it is shaped by guilt. That is one of Thea's strongest emotional complications in Thea film. Maverick thinks he is doing the right thing, or at least the least damaging thing, but Rooster experiences it as betrayal. Both of them are trapped by the same ghost. That is why Maverick's refusal to move on is not only personal, it affects everyone around him. His unresolved guilt becomes a part of Roos's life. His inability to let go becomes another obstacle the younger generation has to fly around. And it is a smart way to age Thea's character. The movie could have simply celebrated him as the last great pilot. Instead, it lets us admire him and question him at the same time. His instincts are extraordinary. His loyalty is real. His courage is not fake. Courage in the air does not automatically become courage on the ground. That is the thing Maverick has to face. For decades, flying has been his answer to everything. It has been his identity, his escape, his proof that he still matters. But now, the film places him in a situation where being brilliant is not enough. He has to confront the emotional wreckage he has spent years outrunning. And for Maverick, that may be harder than on a mission, because the real danger is not just enemy missiles or impossible terrain. It is the possibility that the life he built around never slowing down has also kept him from healing. And that is where the film's real emotional idea starts to come into focus. Top Gun Maverick is obviously a movie about speed, jets, danger, and impossibly flying. That is the surface. That is the part everyone talks about first. And honestly, fair enough, the flying is the hook. But underneath all of that, the movie is really about the past. Not just remembering it, not just honoring it, letting it go. And that is a much harder thing for this film to do than it sounds. Because the entire existence of Top Gun Maverick depends on the past. The movie only matters because people remember the original. Maverick only matters because of who he was. Goose only matters because of what happened. Iceman only matters because of the history between him and Maverick. So the film is in this strange position where it has to celebrate the past while also admitting that living there forever is dangerous. That is what gives the story its emotional shape. Maverick had built his whole life around not moving too far from the man he used to be. He still flies like he is trying to outrun time. He still acts like instinct can solve everything. He still carries Goose to death like an old injury that never healed properly. And then Rooster appears and suddenly the past is not just a memory anymore. It has a face. That is what makes the conflict more painful. Maverick is not dealing with an abstract regret. He is dealing with the son of the man he lost. He is dealing with someone who carries Goose's name, Goose's shadow, and his own anger. Every time Maverick looks at Rooster, he is reminded that the past did not stay frozen in 1986. It kept moving even if he did not. That is a quiet but powerful idea because letting go does not mean pretending the past never mattered. The movie is not saying Maverick should forget Goose or forget Iceman or forget the life that made him who he is. That would feel false. These memories are a part of him. But there is a difference between carrying something and being trapped by it. Maverick had been trapped by it, so has Rooster in his own way. He is not simply angry because Maverick hurt him. He is also living under the pressure of a father he barely gets to define outside of legend. Goose is a memory to the audience, but for Rooster, he is an absence, a missing shape. something he has had to grow around. That is why both men need to move forward. Not because the past is unimportant, but because it has become too heavy. It is affecting how they dressed, how they fly, how they see each other, and how they see themselves. And the film mirrors that same struggle on a larger level. As a sequel, Maverick also has to decide what to do with its own past. Does it simply recreate the first film? Does it reject it? Does it bury it? The answer is somewhere in the middle. It keeps the memory alive, but it also tries to push the story into a new emotional phase. That is when the movie works best, when the nostalgia is not just there to make us smile, but to show us what these characters have been unable to release. And I think that is why the film connects with people beyond the spectacle. Yes, the jets are thrilling. Yes, the sound is huge. Yes, the final mission is built like a crowd-pleasing machine. But the emotional reason it lands is simpler. Everyone understands what it feels like to be pulled backward by something unfinished, a loss, a mistake, a version of yourself you cannot quite leave behind. For Maverick, the challenge is not only surviving the mission, it is accepting that honoring the past does not mean staying there. And of course, the ghost hanging over all of this is a goose. Even after all these years, a goose's death is still the emotional wound that Top Gun keeps returning to. It is the thing that never really left a Maverick. The first film used it as the big tragic turning point, the memento where Maverick's confidence finally crashed into consequence. But in Top Gun Maverick, that loss feels older, quieter, and in some ways heavier. Because now we are not dealing with the shock of Goose dying, we are dealing with the life that continued after it. That is a different kind of pain. Maverick has had decades to live with what happened, and the movie makes it clear that time did not magically cleanse the wound. He did not simply become older and wiser and fully healed. He carried it with him. Maybe he learned how to function around it. Maybe he learned how to smile, fly, work, and keep moving. But he never really got free of it. And that makes Goose's presence interesting because Goose is not physically in the movie in the same way the new characters are, but he shapes almost everything. He shapes a Maverick's guilt. He shapes Ruer's anger. He shapes the way the audience looks at their conflict. Even when nobody is saying his name, the memory of him is sitting there between them. That is what legacy does in this film. It does not just inspire people. It complicates them. For Maverick, Goose is a friend he lost and a mistake he cannot completely forgive himself for, even if the facts around that death are more complicated than simple blame. For Rooster, Goose is a father he barely had the chance to know, but whose absence defines so much of his life. And for the audience, Goose is part of the emotional memory of the original film, which means the sequel can bring all of that historia into the room without needing to explain every detail again. That is useful as storytelling, but it is also risky because when a movie builds so much emotion around a dead character from decades ago, it has to be careful not to turn grief into a shortcut. It cannot just say Goose and expect the entire audience to feel something automatically. The film has to show how that loss still affects the people who survived it, and for the most part, that is where Maverick finds its strongest emotional ground. The pain is not treated like a flashback trophy. It has consequences. Maverick's choices with the Rooster are shaped by it. Rooster's distrust is shaped by it. The tension between them is not just about the personality. It is about a shared wound they experienced from completely different sides. One man lost his best friend, the other lost his father, and somehow both of them ended up blaming a Maverick. That is a heavy place to build a relationship from. It also gives the sequel a reason to exist beyond aircraft and nostalgia. Goose's legacy is not just a callback to make fans remember the first film. It is the emotional death the sequel has to deal with. The first movie left Maverick alive but scarred. This one asks what happens when that scar becomes part of someone else's life too. That is why Rooster matters so much. He turns Goose from a memory into a consequence, and once that happens, a Maverick cannot keep treating the past like something he can privately carry. It is no longer just his pain. It has shaped Rooster too. It has shaped the mission. It has shaped the way Maverick teaches, protects, hesitates, and fears. So even though Goose is gone, the movie never really lets him disappear. He is the missing person at the center of Thea's story. And in a film so obsessed with the speed, machines, and motion, Goose's legacy is the thing that forces everything to slow down just enough to hurt. And then the film brings in a Rooster. This is where the sequel could have easily become lazy, because introducing the son of Goose is such an obvious legacy sequel move that you can almost feel the studio logic behind it. Bring in the child of a beloved character, give him some unresolved anger, put him in the same world as the original hero, and suddenly the old emotional wound has a new face. That kind of thing can feel cheap if it is handled badly. But here it mostly works. Rooster is not just there because the movie needs a younger pilot with a famous last name. His presence changes the temperature of the entire story. The moment Maverick realizes who he is dealing with, the mission stops being just a professional assignment. Ida becomes personal in the way Maverick cannot avoid, because Rooster is not a memory. He is not an old photograph. He is not a flashback. He is not just a Goose's mustache and piano scene brought back for nostalgia. He is a grown mono standing in front of Maverick, carrying years of resentment, confusion, and pain that Maverick helped create, even if he did not mean to. That makes him more than a callback. Rooster represents the part of the past that kept living after Maverick tried to bury it. Goose died, but the consequences did not stop there. His son grew up. His son became a pilot. His son entered the same dangerous world that took his father away, and now a Maverick is being asked to train him for a mission where survival is anything but guaranteed. That is a brutal emotional setup, because Maverick is not simply afraid of losing another pilot. He is afraid of losing Goose's son, and that a difference matters. Every decision he makes around Rooster is tangled up with old grief. He wants to protect him. But protection from Maverick does not always feel like love. Sometimes it feels like control. Sometimes it feels like mistrust. And for Rooster, that is the wound. He does not see Maverick as the grieving friend trying to do the right thing. He sees the man who interfered with his future. The man who held him back, the man connected to the father he lost and the career he has had to fight for. That gives the relationship a natural bitterness. Rooster does not need to shout in every scene for us to understand it. There is a stiffness in him around Maverick, a refusal to give him the easy emotional reunion that a lesser version of this story might have forced too quickly. And that is important, because Rooster is not just there to forgive Maverick so the audience can feel better. He has his own burden. He has grown up under a legacy he did not choose, trying to prove himself in a world where everyone knows his father's name might already have an idea of who he is supposed to be. That is a difficult place to live. If he fails, he is not Goose. If he succeeds, he is still Goose's son. The movie does not explore every corner of that idea as deeply as it could, but the foundation is strong. Rooster gives the film an emotional pressure point that the first movie never had. He turns the old tragedy into something active, something unresolved, something that still has the power to shape choices in the present, and Miles Teller fits that space well. He has enough of the visual echo of Goose for the connection to register immediately, but he does not play Rooster like a copy. He is more guarded, more wounded, less openly warm. There is a heaviness to him, like he has spent a long time trying to carry an enemy that everyone else remembers differently than he does. That is what makes him useful to the sequel. He is both familiar and new. He brings the audience back to Goose, but he also forces the story to move beyond Goose, because Rooster is not simply a symbol of what a Maverick lost. He is a person Maverick has to face, respect, and eventually trust. And in a movie built around the speed, Rooster is the emotional drug pulling Maverick back to the one thing he cannot outrun. The past did not stay buried. It grew up and learned to fly. The heart of the movie, at least emotionally, is the conflict between a Maverick and Rooster. Not the mission, not the aircraft, not even Thea nostalgia. Those things are the engine, sure, but the wound underneath the movie is sitting between these two men. And what makes their conflict work is that neither side is completely simple. Maverick is not some cold authoritative figure trying to block Rooster out of cruelty. He is carrying guilt. He is carrying fear. He is carrying the memory of Goose in a way that has shaped almost every decision he makes around Rooster. In his mind, he has probably spent years convincing himself that he was protecting the boy. But Rooster did not experience it that way. To him, Maverick is not just the legendary pilot who flew with his father. He is the man who stood in the way, the man who delayed his career, the man who made decisions about his future without giving him control over his own life. And that is a very different kind of betrayal, because when someone hurts you while claiming they were protecting you, the pain becomes so harder to untangle. You can understand their reason and still resent the result. You can know they were scared and still feel robbed. That is where Ruer's anger comes from. He is not just angry because Goose died. He is angry because Maverick is still there, still involved, still making choices, still standing in the space where his father should have been. And every time Maverick tries to guide him, Rooster hears something else underneath it: control, doubt, fear. The film gets a lot of mileage out of that tension because it does not resolve it immediately. These two do not just have one emotional conversation and move on. The distrust sits there. It follows Thema into training. It affects how they fly, how they listen, how they respond under pressure. And for Maverick, that creates a painful contradiction. He has to prepare Rooster for a mission that could kill him, while every instinct in his body wants to keep him safe. He has to teach him to be fast, decisive, and aggressive, while knowing that if Rooster makes one mistake, Maverick may feel like he has lost Goose all over again. That is brutal. It is also exactly the kind of emotional pressure this sequel needed. Without Rooster, Maverick's return could have been mostly about proving he still has it. With Rooster, the story becomes about whether Maverick can stop trying to control the consequences of a tragedy that happened decades ago. And Rooster has his own lesson to learn, too, because his resentment is understandable, but it also traps him. He is so cautious, so measured, so unwilling to fully trust Maverick that his pain starts to become a part of how he flies. He is not reckless like Maverick. He holds back. He hesitates. He carries the weight differently, but he is still carrying it. That is what makes them mirror each other. Maverick cannot let go of guilt. Rooster cannot let go of anger. Both of them are flying with ghosts in the cockpit. Now, does the film explore Thea's relationship as deeply as it possibly could have? Maybe not. There are moments where you can feel the blockbuster machinery wanting to move forward before the emotional drama has fully breathed. A quieter film might have sat with their conflict longer. It might have made the resentment messier, more uncomfortable, less neatly shaped for a final act to pay off. But for the kind of movie Thieves is, the conflict gives the story real weight. It turns the mission into more than a technical challenge. It gives us every training run an emotional charge. When Maverick pushes Rooster, it is not just instructor versus student. It is guilt versus grief, protection versus independence, the past versus the future. And eventually, the movie has to bring them to the same place. Not because everything is suddenly healed, that would be too easy, but because survival requires trust. At some point, both men have to stop flying against the memory of Goose and start flying with each other. That is the emotional test hidden inside the action movie. The mission asks whether they can hit the target. The story asks whether they can finally stop punishing each other for a loss. Neither of them can change. What you like about Rooster is that his conflict is not only about being angry at Maverick. That is the obvious layer, and the movie definitely uses it. He walks into the story with resentment already built into him. You can feel the history before anyone explains it. Underneath that anger is something a little more complicated. Rooster is carrying a father he barely got to know, and that is a strange kind of grief. Ida is not the same as Maverick's grief. Maverick remembers Goose as a friend. A partner, a man with a voice and jokes and a personality. He has actual memories to hold on to. Rooster, on the other hand, is living with a legacy that other people understand more clearly than he does. That can mess with a person, because when your father becomes a legend to everyone else, where does that leave you? Are you supposed to live up to him, escape him, repeat him, prove you belong in the same world? Or prove you are your own man? The film does not stop to spell all of that out, but it is sitting inside the character. Rooster is not reckless like Maverick. He does not fly like someone desperate to burn through every limit in front of him. He is more cautious, more controlled, sometimes to a fault, and that makes sense. He is not just trying to be good. He is trying not to become another tragedy. That is what gives his flying a different emotional texture. Maverick flies like he is running from the past. Rooster flies like he is afraid of repeating it, and those are two very different kinds of fear. The painful irony is that Rooster has chosen the exact life that took his father away from him. He becomes a pilot anyway. He enters the same dangerous world, trains under the same institution, and eventually ends up being taught by the man most closely connected to his father's death. That is not just career ambition. That is emotional unfinished business. He may not even fully know what he is looking for. Maybe he wants answers. Maybe he wants to prove he can survive what Goose did not. Maybe he wants to stand in the cockpit and feel close to a father who exists mostly as stories, photographs, and other people's memories. Whatever the reason, it gives a Rooster a quiet heaviness. And Miles Teller plays him with that guarded quality. He does not make Rooster a loud, constantly explosive character. There is anger there, yes, but it is held back, tightened, controlled, like he is someone who has learned to keep his pain organized, because if he lets it spill out, he might not know what to do with it. That is why his scenes with Maverick have such a stiff energy. Rooster does not want easy comfort from him. He does not want a father figure handed to him by the script. He does not want Maverick to simply explain everything and make the wound disappear. His pain has been with him too long for that, and that makes him feel more believable. He is not just Goose's son as a plot device. At least at his best. He is some idiot trying to live under a name that means something different to everyone around him. To Maverick, Goose is guilt. To the audience, Goose is nostalgia. To a Rooster, Goose is absence. That a distinction matters because absence can become heavier than memory. Memory gives you something to hold. Absence gives you questions. So while Maverick is trying to make peace with the past, Rooster is trying to understand what the past even means for him. He is not simply stuck because he refuses to forgive Maverick. He is stuck because his whole identity has been shaped around someone who is no longer there. That is the emotional burden he brings into the cockpit. Every training run, every hesitation, every moment where he pulls back, you can read it as more than just a tactical flaw. Ida is a man trying to survive both the mission in front of him and the legacy behind him, and that is why Rooster works. He is not the flashiest pilot in the group. He is not the loudest. He is not the one stealing every scene with a swagger. He is the one carrying the most ghosts. And then there is Iceman. This is one of those parts of Top Gun Maverick where the movie could have easily gone wrong. Bringing back Vala Kilmer was always going to carry a load of emotional weight. Not just because of what Iceman meant in the original film, but because of what Kilmer himself brings into the scene now. And the film knows that. It does not overuse him. Ida does not try to force him into the story as a cheap nostalgia cameo. It gives him one important scene. And honestly, that is enough, because when Iceman appears, the whole movie slows down in a way it really needs to. For most of the film, everything is movement, jets, training, deadlines, pressure, competition. Even the emotional conflicts are pushed forward by the mission. But the Iceman scene feels different. It has stillness. It has history. It lets two characters sit in the same room with decades between them. And suddenly, The movie feels less like a sequel trying to honor the past and more like two old friends quietly facing it. That is why the scene works. Iceman is no longer just the rival from the first movie. He is noted the cocky opponent, the polished Goldina boy, the man Maverick had to measure himself against. Time has changed that relationship. Whatever competition existed between them has turned into something gentler and more meaningful. There is respect now. More than that, there is understanding. Iceman sees a Maverick in a way almost no one else does. The Admiral sees a problem. The young pilots see a legend or an obstacle. Rooster sees pain, but Iceman sees the whole person. He remembers the reckless young man, but he also sees the older man still carrying the same grief, the same guilt, the same inability to let go, and that gives the scenes a power. It is not just, "Look, Iceman back." It is not just the movie waving at fans of the original. It actually matters to Maverick's emotional journey. Iceman is the one person who can tell him the truth without it sounding like an order. He can push Maverick toward the thing he has been avoiding, not because he outranks him, but because he knows him. That history makes every quiet moment feel heavier. And then, of course, there is Val Kilmer himself. Knowing what Kilmer has gone through in real life adds a layer that the film does not need to explain too much. It's already there. You feel it in the way the scene is staged, in the way Cruiser responds to him, in the way the movie lets silence and presence do more than a dialogue could. It becomes one of the rare moments where the real world and the movie world overlap without feeling exploitative. That is difficult to pull it off. A lesser film might have turned the scene into a sentimental spectacle. It might have pushed too hard, forced a bigger emotional release, or made the whole thing feel like a tribute video inside the movie. But Maverick shows a little restraint here. It lets the emotion come from the fact that the two men are simply together again, older now, changed now, but still connected, and that is enough. The scene also reminds us how much time has passed, not in a flashy way, not through a montage or a speech, just by letting Maverick and Iceman share space. You look at theme and feel the distance between the first film and this one. You feel the years. You feel the losses. You feel the strange tenderness of seeing rivals become the people who understand each other best. For me, that is some of the strongest emotional material in the film. Because Iceman's return does not exist only to make the audience nostalgic. It gives Maverick permission, maybe even a command, to face what he has been running from. It reminds him that being loyal to the past does not mean staying trapped inside it. And after that scene, the movie feels a little different. The mission is still there. The jets are still waiting. The blockbuster machinery keeps moving. For a moment, Top Gun Maverick stops the chasing speed and gives us something much quieter. A goodbye, a blessing, and one old friend telling another that it is finally time to move forward. What makes the Iceman scene even more important is that it does not exist in isolation. It is not just an emotional cameo. It is basically the film saying its central idea out loud, but in the gentlest way possible. Maverick has to move forward, and the reason that lands is because it comes from Iceman, not from a superior officer barking at him. Not from a younger pilot challenging him. Not from some obvious speech about it growing up and changing with the times. It comes from the one person in the story who truly understands what a Maverick has been carrying. That matters because Iceman is part of the past too. He belongs to the same history Maverick who keeps circling. He was there when a Maverick was young, reckless, brilliant, and broken by Goose's death. He saw the version of Maverick that became legendary, but he also saw the damage underneath that legend. So when Iceman tells him in his own way that it is time to let go, it does not feel like the movie dismissing the past. It feels like the past itself giving Maverick permission to leave. That is a beautiful idea because Maverick's problem has never been that he does not care. If anything, he cares too much. He holds on to people, mistakes, guilt, and promises until they become part of his identity. He has confused loyalty with punishment. Somewhere along the way, Remembering a goose became inseparable from blooming himself. Protecting Rooster became inseparable from controlling him. And Iceman sees that he understands that a Maverick cannot lead these pilots properly if he is still trying to rewrite history. He cannot help Rooster become his own man if he keeps seeing him only through Goose's death. He cannot survive emotionally if every decision is shaped by an old wound. That is why this scene quietly changes the movie. Before it, Maverick is still resisting the full truth of what he has to do. He wants to train the pilots, yes. He wants to complete the mission, yes. But emotionally he is still trying to manage the past instead of releasing it. Iceman pushes him toward acceptance, not in some neat magical way. The movie does not pretend one conversation fixes decades of grief. That would feel false. But the scene gives Maverick something he has probably needed for years. Someone who knows the whole story, telling him that holding on is no longer the same thing as honoring. That a distinction is huge. Honoring Goose does not mean keeping Rooster frozen under protection. Honoring Iceman does not mean refusing to change. Honoring the past does not mean living like time stopped when the first movie ended. And that is also why the scene feels connected to the film as a sequel. Top Gun Maverick is doing the same thing Maverick has to do. It has to respect the past without becoming trapped inside it. It has to bring back old feelings, old music, old names, and old images, but then use them to move somewhere else. The Iceman scene becomes almost a quiet instruction manual for the whole movie. Remember where you came from, respect what mattered, but do not confuse memory with life. That is the emotional wisdom Iceman brings. And maybe that is why his presence feels so powerful despite being brief. He does not need a lot of screen time. He carries the weight of decades with him. He represents friendship, rivalry, survival, age, illness, loyalty, and the strange grace of knowing when to tell someone the truth. For Maverick, that truth is painful. He cannot keep flying away from what happened. He cannot keep treating Rooster like a second chance to save Goose. He cannot keep defining himself only by the parts of his life that hurt the most. At some point, even a Maverick has to land. An Iceman, more than anyone else in the film, is the person who helps him understand that a landing does not mean surrender. Sometimes it means finally being ready to live. Then there is Penny Benjamin, and honestly, this is one of those parts of Top Gun Maverick that could have felt like a complete afterthought because in a movie this focused on jets, legacy, training, and old emotional wounds, the romantic subplot is not exactly the main attraction. Nobody is walking into this film thinking, I really hope the love story gets equal screen time with the fighter planes. But the movie still needs something on the ground. It needs a part of Maverick's life that is not military orders, cockpit pressure, or unresolved guilt. It needs someone who can look at him not as Captain Mitchell, not as a legend, not as a problem for the Navy to deal with, but simply as a Pete. That is where Penny comes in. What is interesting is that she is not treated like a random new love interest dropped into the sequel just because the movie needed romance. She has a connection to the old Top Gun for a world, even if she was only mentioned before and never really part of the original story on screen. So, bringing her in gives the film a link to the past without literally trying to recreate the Charlie romance. And that was probably the right choice because if the sequel had simply brought back the exact same romantic dynamic from the first film, it might have felt too neat, too nostalgic in the wrong way. Penny gives the movie a slightly different energy. She feels like someone who has known versions of Maverick over time. Someone who has seen the charm, the irresponsibility, the disappearing act, and the damage that comes with loving a man who never really stays still. That makes their relationship feel lived in. Even when the film does not spend a huge amount of time explaining it, you get the sense that this is not their first chapter. It is more like another attempt at something that has probably failed before, and that fits Maverick perfectly because his romantic life seems to have the same problem as the rest of his life. He is good at intensity, no stability. Penny understands that she is so warm with him. But she is not naive about him. She likes him. Maybe even loves him. But she also knows exactly what kind of man he is. She knows Thea's smile. She knows the thrill. She knows the pattern. And Jennifer Connelly brings a lot to that. She gives Penny a calm, grounded presence that helps balance the movie. In a film full of competitive pilots and military pressure, she feels like an adult in Thea's room. Not boring, not stiff, just someone with a life, a daughter, a business, and enough history to not be dazzled by Maverick's whole routine. That is important because Maverick needs someone who is not impressed by Thea legend. The young pilots may look at him with suspicion or awe. The admirals might see him as a liability, but Penny says the man behind all of that. And she is one of the few characters who can call him out without turning the scene into a confrontation. Their scenes are not the most explosive parts of the movie, and they are not meant to be. They work more like pauses, a breath between Thea training runs. A reminder that Maverick is not only facing professional consequences, but personal ones, too. If he cannot stop living like every day is another day, then what kind of life is he actually building? That is the quiet question Penny brings into the film. Now, is the romance deeply developed? Not really. The movie sketches it more than it fully explores it. There are moments where it feels like the film is relying on charm and history rather than giving the relationship a lot of dramatic weight on the page, but some of it mostly gets away with it, partly because Cruise and Connelly have an easy, mature chemistry. Their scenes do not feel like a forced young romance awkwardly inserted into an action movie. They feel age-appropriate, relaxed, and a little bittersweet. Two people will have made mistakes, drifted apart, circled back, and maybe still see something worth saving, and that is enough for the role this subplot plays. Penny is not there to take over the movie. She is there to give Maverick a glimpse of a life beyond the cockpit, a life where being brave might mean staying, not leaving, listening, not approving, letting someone know you before you disappear again. Or a film that's obsessed with speed, that matters. Because Penny represents something a Maverick has never been especially good at. A reason to come home. Now, the romance with Penny is one of those parts of the movie where I can understand both reactions. On one hand, it works better than it probably needed to. Cruise and Jennifer Connelly have a comfortably chemistry. It does not feel awkward. It does not feel like the movie is trying to convince us that Maverick is suddenly in some grand sweeping romance that has to compete with the main plot. Theater scenes have a lighter, more relaxed quality, and that helps the film breathe a little. There is also something refreshing about the fact that the romance feels age-appropriate and mature. This is not Maverick trying to relive his youth with someone who makes the movie feel like it is desperately chasing a younger audience. Penny feels like someone from his world, someone with her own history, her own life, and her own patience limits. She is not there just to look impressed when he walks into a room. And that matters because Maverick does not need someone who worships him. He needs someone who knows exactly how charming he can be and exactly how exhausting that charm probably becomes after a while. That is the best version of their dynamic. At the same time, I do think the romance is one of the thinner parts of the film. Not bad, just thin. The movie gives you enough to understand the relationship, but not always enough to deeply feel it. A lot of the emotional history between Maverick and Penny is implied rather than built. We are told, or at least are strongly encouraged to believe, that there is a long pattern between them. They have known each other, missed each other, disappointed each other, come back to each other, and that can work. But it also means the film is leaning pretty heavily on the actors to sell what the script only lightly sketches. Luckily, Cruise and Connelly can do that. They give the scenes a warmth that might not be fully present on the page. Connelly especially brings this grounded adult energy that keeps Penny from feeling completely decorative. She has a calm confidence and she plays Penny like he is someone who has already survived the Maverick experience before. Still, I would not say the romance is one of the movie's strongest dramatic elements. It is pleasant. It is charming. It gives a Maverick somewhere to go when the movie needs to step away from the airfield. But if you pulled it out, the main emotional structure of the film would still mostly remain intact. The real emotional engine is Maverick, Rooster, a goose, an Iceman. Penny is more like an emotional counterweight. She reminds USA that Maverick's inability to move forward is not only about grief or military rank, it also affects his personal life. He is a man who can commit completely to a mission, to committing to a normal life that is much harder for him. So, the romance does have a purpose, it just does not always feel fully developed. There are moments where it feels natural and lived in. And then there are moments where it feels like the movie remembers, right? We need a love interest here. That is not a disaster because the film never lets the subplot take over, but it does mean the romance sometimes feels more functional than essential, and depending on what you want from the movie, that may or may not bother you. If you are here for the jets, the mission, and the legacy drama, Penny's scenes probably feel like an icy pause. If you are looking for a deeply written romantic arc, there may not be quite enough there. For me, it lands somewhere in the middle. I like the chemistry. I like the maturity. I like that Penny gives Maverick a space where he can be more than the Navy's beautiful problem child. But I also wish the movie had given her a little more interior life beyond what she means to him, because Jennifer Connelly is doing a lot with a role that sometimes feels smaller than it should be. She makes Penny feel real even when the writing only gives USA the outline of a real person. So yes, the romance works. But it works because of the actors, the tone, and the emotional texture around the edges. Nota because the subplot itself is especially rich. Jennifer Connelly deserves a little extra attention here because of when Penny is not the deepest written character in the movie. Connelly gives her a presence that makes the subplot feel more grounded than it might have been otherwise. That is not always easy in a film like this. Top Gun Maverick is so dominated by speed, military pressure, male rivalry, legacy, and Tom Cruise's whole action star gravity that a romantic interest could very easily disappear into the background. She could have been there just to smile at Maverick, tell him to be careful and remind the audience that he has a personal life somewhere off the runway. But Connelly does not play Penny like a decoration. She gives her this calm, alive and confidence. Penny feels like he is someone who has been through enough life to not be overwhelmed by Maverick's charm. She likes him clearly, but she is not dazzled by him, and that distinction matters because Maverick is the kind of character who can easily bend a scene around himself. With Penny, he cannot completely do that. She knows him too well. There is something very effective about watching Maverick, this legendary pilot who still frustrates admirals and terrifies younger flyers, suddenly become a little less certain around her. Not helpless. Not awkward in a forced romantic comedy way, just slightly exposed like she is one of the few people who remembers that behind all the myth, he is also a man who has disappointed people, disappeared from relationships, and probably made the same mistake more than once. Connelly brings that history without needing a huge monologue. A look does a lot. A pause does a lot. The way she does not rush to forgive him does a lot. That is why Penny works better than the writing alone might suggest. The script gives USA the outline of a woman who has known a Maverick before and understands his patterns. But Connelly fills in the emotional texture. She makes you believe Penny has a life outside of the scene as we see. She owns a bar, she has a daughter, she has boundaries, she has a warmth, but not endless patience. And in a movie full of people either challenging Maverick or admiring him, Penny feels like someone who simply says to him, that is a different kind of role. She is not there to compete with the fighter jets because almost nothing in this movie is going to compete with the fighter jets, but she gives the film a softer register. Her scenes allow a Maverick to exist outside the cockpit without the entire movie losing a momentum. That is important because the film needs a reminder that Maverick's life cannot just be measured in missions survived. What happens after the adrenaline fades? Who is waiting? What kind of future is he actually capable of building? Penny does not answer all of those questions, but her presence makes them visible, and I think that is why the casting works. Connelly brings a maturity without making the scenes feel heavy. She brings beauty obviously, but also a sense of emotional steadiness. There is a quiet authority to her performance. She does not need to dominate the movie to matter inside it. If anything, she gives Maverick something the rest of the film rarely gives him, a place where being impressive is not enough. In the air, a Maverick can prove himself through a skill. With the younger pilots, he can prove himself through experience. With the Navy, he can prove himself through results. But with Penny, the question is different. Can he stay? Can he listen? Can he be trusted when there is no mission forcing him to show up? That is what Connelly quietly brings to the film. She turns what could have been a very standard romantic subplot into something warmer, more adult, and more believable than expected. The role might be limited, but the presence is not. Only a thing that is noticeable about a Top Gun Maverick is how selective it is about the past. The movie brings back a Maverick. It brings back Iceman. It brings back Goose through Rooster, through memory, through music, through the emotional shape of the story, but it does not bring everyone back, and that a choice is worth talking about because when a sequel arrives this many years later, especially one built so openly around legacy, there is always that temptation to turn it into a reunion. Bring back every familiar face, give everyone a cameo. Let the audience point at the screen every 10 minutes and say, oh, I remember them. Maverick mostly avoids that. Kelly McGillis is not here. Me Ryan is not here. Tom Skerritt is not here. And depending on how attached you are to the original, that might feel strange at first. These characters were a part of the old film's emotional and visual memory, so their absence does leave a little space around the edges. But I can also understand why the sequel does not force them in. This movie is already carrying a lot of nostalgia, maybe too much in places. If it had also tried to bring back every original character, it could have started to feel less like a story and more like a roll call. And that is one of the dangers with legacy sequels. They can become so busy honoring the past that they forget to create a present. So instead, the film chooses its returns carefully. Iceman matters because his presence changes Maverick's emotional journey. Goose matters because his absence still shapes the central conflict. Those pieces are not just references, they are structural. They affect what Maverick does, what Rooster feels, and what the film is actually about. The missing characters, on the other hand, would have needed a real reason to be there, and maybe the movie simply did not have the room for that. Still, their absence does say something. It reminds us that time has passed in a way that is not always neat or sentimental. Not everyone from the past stays in the story. Not every relationship gets revisited. Not every old face returns for closure. That actually fits the movie more than a full reunion would have. Maverick's life, also we see it here, is not full of people from the first film standing around waiting for him. It is full of gaps, losses, old names, people who moved on, people who disappeared, people who are remembered more than seen. There is a quiet realism in that even inside a movie that is otherwise very polished and very blockbuster. Of course, you can still argue that some exclusions feel convenient. The movie has time for certain callbacks, certain musical cues, certain recreated images, but not for every character who mattered before. That selectiveness can feel a little calculated. It keeps only the pieces of the past that serve this particular version of Maverick's story. But that is also what keeps the film from becoming overcrowded. A legacy sequel has to make choices, and Top Gun Maverick chooses to focus less on reunion and more on consequence. It is not really asking where is everyone now. It is asking what parts of the past still have power over Maverick. That is why Goose and Iceman remain essential and why the others, even if missed, stay outside the frame. Their absence may not satisfy everyone, but it does keep the movie pointed in one direction. This is not a class reunion. It is not a nostalgia parade. It is Maverick being forced to face the memories that still have unfinished business with him. And after all the talk about legacy, nostalgia, politics, character arcs, and whether the film leans too hard on the past, there is only a very simple thing that has to be said. Top Gun Maverick is just extremely entertaining. That sounds basic, I know, almost too basic, but sometimes that's the thing a blockbuster has to get right before anything else matters. You can have themes, callbacks, emotional baggage, technical ambition, all of that. But if the movie does not actually move, if it does not give the audience the feeling of being pulled into the screen, then the whole machine starts to feel pointless. This movie moves. It has the clean old-fashioned sense of momentum where each scene feels like it is pushing you closer to something. Even when the story is predictable, even when you can sense where certain emotional beats are going, the film rarely feels dead. It keeps giving you a reason to stay with it. Part of that is the mission structure, part of it is Tom Cruise, part of it is the flying, and part of it is simply that the movie understands better than most modern legacy sequels. It knows when to slow down for emotion, when to bring back a familiar cue, when to let the pilots clash, and when to throw the audience into the air and let the jets do the talking. And honestly, once the planes are in the sky, the movie becomes very hard to resist. There is a physical thrill to those sequences that you do not always get from big studio action anymore. You feel the speed, you feel the pressure, you feel the pilot straining inside the cockpit, even if you know the story is built to satisfy. Even if you know the film is designed to send people out smiling, the action still has a pulse. That is why so many people responded to it. It is not because the plot is revolutionary. It is not because every character is deeply written. It is not because the movie has something brand new to say about war, aviation, or American mythology. It is because it delivers. Sometimes that is enough. There is a kind of confidence in a Maverick that feels almost refreshing now. It is not embarrassed to be a big crowd movie. It is not constantly winking at the audience to prove it knows it is cheesy. It is not trying to undercut every sincere moment with a joke. When it wants to be emotional, it is emotional. When it wants to be thrilling, it goes all in. When it wants it to be corny, it just accepts that also part of the package. And that sincerity helps because this kind of movie can become ridiculous very easily. Fighter pilots speaking in dramatic one-liners, old wounds resurfacing at the perfect moment, a nearly impossible mission with a tiny window of success, a hero who is still somehow better than everyone else after all these years. On paper, it is a lot, but the film plays it with a craft and conviction that you stop fighting it, you settle into the ride. You let the old-school blockbuster energy do what it is supposed to do. That does not mean the movie is flawless. It is safe in places. It is familiar. It has thin supporting characters. Some of the nostalgia is heavy. Some of the emotional beats are very clearly engineered. But entertainment is not always about a surprise. Sometimes it is about execution. It is about taking familiar ingredients and serving them with a speed, polish, and feeling that the audience still leaves satisfied. And that is exactly what Top Gun Maverick does. It reminds you that a movie can be simple without being empty, conventional without being lifeless, nostalgic without feeling completely hollow. It is a polished piece of mainstream filmmaking that knows what it is selling, and more importantly, knows how to sell it well. By the time the final stretch arrives, the movie has done a groundwork that the spectacle feels earned. You understand the mission. You would understand the emotional stakes. You would understand why Maverick has to be there, why Rooster matters, why the team has to come together, and why the whole thing is built to make the audience grip the seat a little tighter. That is entertainment craft, not subtle. Maybe, not groundbreaking, but effective. And sometimes, especially with a movie like this, effective is exactly what you came here for. One of the strangest things about Top Gun Maverick is that it actually lived up to the hype, and I do not say it lightly because hype can be poisonous for a movie like this. When the people keep telling you a blockbuster is amazing, when the reviews are glowing, when audiences are walking out acting like they have just witnessed the resurrection of cinema itself, it becomes very easy to sit down with your arms crossed and think, all right, impress me. That is a dangerous position for any film to be in, especially a sequel like this, because before watching it, skepticism feels completely reasonable. A decades later follow-up to an 80s classic, Tom Cruise returning to one of his most famous roles, a story built around nostalgia, young pilots, familiar music, and the fighter jets. That could have easily been empty. It could have been an author legacy sequel praised mostly because people wanted to feel something familiar again, and for some viewers, maybe that is exactly how it played. Not everyone bought into it. There are definitely a people who found the movie overpraised, too safe, too nostalgic, too polished for its own good. And I understand that a reaction. When a film receives this much praise, the flaws can start to feel louder. The conventional plot, the heavy callbacks, the underdeveloped idea characters, the political vagueness. If those things bother you, the hype probably makes them bother you even more, because then you are not just reacting to the movie, you are reacting to the conversation around the movie that matters. Sometimes a good film gets turned into an impossible object by the way people talk about it. It stops being this is a really strong blockbuster and becomes this is the movie that saved the theaters. And once the conversation reaches that level, disappointment becomes almost unavoidable for anyone who does not have the same emotional response. But I also think the audience reaction makes sense because Top Gun Maverick arrived at a moment when people were hungry for exactly this kind of a movie. A clean, muscular, emotional, a practical-looking big-screen action film that did not feel like homework. It was not asking viewers to remember 10 other installments, track multiverse rules, or wait for the post-credit setup. It gave people a mission, a movie star, a legacy wound, and action scenes that actually felt physical. That kind of simplicity can hit hard when it is done well, and this film is done well. That is why so many people walked out buzzing. Not because it is flawless. It is not, but because it delivers a feeling that a lot of modern blockbusters chase and do not always catch. The feeling that you saw was something made for the big screen, made with effort, made with confidence, and made to send the audience satisfied. There is value in that. You can criticize the film's safety and still understand the pleasure of it. You can point out the predictable beats and still admit they land. You can see the nostalgia machinery working and still feel yourself respond when the music arises and the jets steer across the screen. That is the push and pull of Maverick. For fans of the original, it probably felt like a gift. For people who were lukewarm on the first film, it may have been a surprise. For viewers who already dislike this kind of military action fantasy, it was probably never going to fully win them over. But the fact that it connected so widely says something. It says audiences were not only responding to the brand name, they were responding to the craft, to the clarity, to the sense of effort, to the idea that a blockbuster can be old-fashioned without feeling completely dead. That is why the hype, while maybe inflated in places, was not fake. There is a real movie underneath it, a very polished movie. A very calculated movie, a movie that knows exactly how to press certain buttons, but also a movie that presses them with skill. And in the end, that is why the audience response does not feel like some random wave of nostalgia blindness. It feels like people recognizing a type of cinematic pleasure they had missed, even if, depending on your taste, that pleasure may come with a few too many familiar chords playing in the background. So, where does that leave Top Gun Maverick in the end? For me, it lands as one of those rare legacy sequels that probably should have been unnecessary and yet somehow justifies itself. Not perfectly, not without flaws. Not without moments where you can feel the nostalgia machine working a little too hard, but it justifies itself more than most movies like this ever do, because the easy version of this film would have been a simple, bring back Tom Cruise. Play the music, show the jets, mention Goose, give the audience a few familiar images, a young cast, a final mission, and let everyone leave feeling like they visited an old memory. And yes, Maverick does some of that. It absolutely leans into nostalgia and knows exactly when to push those familiar emotional buttons. It understands that audiences want the sound, the speed, the jacket, the call signs, the competitive energy, and the thrill of watching fighter jets steer across the sky as if cinema itself was designed for that image. But the reason the film works is that it does not stop there. At its best, Top Gun Maverick understands that returning to the past is not the same as living in it. The movie is deeply nostalgic, but it is also surprisingly skeptical of nostalgia. It gives Maverick his old world back, only to force him to realize that the past cannot save him unless he is willing to change. That is what gives all the spectacle its emotional weight. Maverick is not simply trying to prove that he can still fly. He is confronting the guilt he has carried for years, the friendships he has lost, the relationships he has damaged, and a younger generation that must now face danger without being held back by his fears. Around the emotional core, the film builds an impressively focused blockbuster. The mission is clear, the stakes are easy to understand, the training has a real purpose, and the action is genuinely thrilling. That may sound basic, but it is remarkable how many modern blockbusters manage to forget these fundamentals. Maverick does not. It knows how to build tension, how to pace a final mission, how to make the audience understand the danger, and how to turn physical filmmaking into part of the emotional experience. The aerial sequences are not simply technically impressive, they give the movie its pulse. They are a major reason the film feels alive in a way that so much weightless digital spectacle does not. You can almost feel the pressure and the speed. You can sense the bodies inside those machines. Even when the story follows a predictable path, the filmmaking gives those familiar moments real power. Still, I do not think the movie is beyond criticism. Some supporting characters could have been developed more deeply. The romance works largely because of the actors rather than the writing. Some of the callbacks feel a little too heavy-handed, and the enemy is kept deliberately vague, which can make the film's politics feel overly clean, safe, and carefully polished. If you are not already receptive to this kind of old-school military action fantasy, I doubt the movie will completely change your mind. There are also moments when the film seems very aware of its own legend, perhaps a little too aware. It wants to honor the original, revive the theatrical experience, protect Tom Cruise's star image, satisfy longtime fans, introduce a new generation of pilots, resolve old emotional wounds, and deliver a crowd-pleasing finale. That is a tremendous amount of pressure for one movie. At times, you can feel it trying to carry all of those responsibilities at once. And yet, somehow, most of the time, it holds together. That is the achievement. Top Gun: Maverick is not great because it is original. It is not great because it reinvents the action genre or tells a story audiences have never seen before. It is great, or at least extremely effective, because it takes familiar material and executes it with conviction, precision, and enough emotional honesty to make that familiarity feel satisfying rather than hollow. It is cheesy, but usually in a self-aware way. It is nostalgic, but not completely trapped in the past. It is conventional, but rarely lazy. It is polished, but never lifeless. Most importantly, it remembers that a blockbuster should make you feel something in the moment, not simply recognize a brand, wait for the next installment, or admire the size of the budget. It should make you feel excitement, sadness, tension, and that slightly ridiculous movie star joy, the almost embarrassing thrill of watching a huge screen action movie deliver exactly what it promised. That is why Top Gun: Maverick connected with audiences. It gave people a piece of the past, but infused it with enough present-day energy to make that past feel alive again. And for a sequel arriving 36 years later, that is no small achievement. It is almost a miracle.